This is a review of Unit 5 of AP U.S. Government and Politics entitled The United States Congress. The framers of our Constitution established the legislative branch in Article 1 of the Constitution. They did this for two reasons. They wanted to make Congress the primary lawmaking body of the country, and they wanted to send the message that Congress was to be the most dominant branch of government. They established our Congress to be bicameral. This means that it has two chambers to help with the lawmaking process. They did this for several reasons. One, it was a compromise that was reached at the Constitutional Convention between the more and less populated states. Two, it would create a more deliberate and slow lawmaking process so that they could assure that the laws being passed were for the good of the entire country. And it created an intra-branch check as the two chambers would be able to keep each other from gaining too much power. The lower of the two houses of Congress is known as the House of Representatives. To run for the House of Representatives, a person must be at least 25 years old, a 7-year citizen of the United States, and a resident of the district that they wish to represent. Their tenure of office is the shortest of any federally elected official, just a 2-year term, though they can run for as many consecutive terms as they wish. Their jurisdiction or constituency is the people of their elected congressional district. Each of those districts is drawn in a way that reflects relatively equal populations. Take, for example, the state of Maryland. Maryland has 8 congressional districts. This means it has 8 members in the U.S. House of Representatives. If it seems as if members of the House are constantly campaigning, well, it's because they are. Every member of the House is up for re-election every 2 years. They are elected by what is known as a single-member plurality system. What this means is that all of the candidates who wish to represent a district are listed, but only one of them, the one with the most votes, will become that district's representative. This tends to create a huge advantage for the two mainstream parties, the Democrats and Republicans, since they have more financial backing and more name recognition. There is also a huge advantage to being an incumbent running for re-election in the House. Statistically, over 90% of House incumbents will win their re-election, or at least their party will retain their seat. There are several reasons for why incumbents do so well in the House. One of which is that the districts are so badly gerrymandered that districts are usually either very conservative or very liberal. This tends to lead to races that are much more exciting in the primaries than in the actual general race, when it's pretty well known that the other party has no chance. The name recognition of the incumbent plays a big part in this, as do the easier access to campaign money and the ability to provide casework at that moment to a constituent. The House of Representatives has 435 total members, each of which represents one of the 435 congressional districts across the country. The leader of the House of Representatives is known as the Speaker of the House. They are selected by the majority party after each election cycle and begin at the start of a new term in January. They are also responsible for presiding over each session that occurs in the House. Ohio Republican John Boehner is the current Speaker of the House of Representatives and has held that post since January of 2011. He's responsible for overseeing the very important Rules Committee and regularly consulting with the President on the flow of legislation. According to the Constitution's 25th Amendment, the Speaker of the House is also second in line to succeed to the presidency, just behind the Vice President, in the event of an emergency. It is critical to be in the majority party in either House of Congress, but especially when it comes to the House of Representatives. Being in the majority party allows you some of the following advantages. One, you of course get to pick the Speaker. You're able to control the very important Rules Committee in the House. You control all of the chairperson roles in each committee, and you're able to better control the flow of legislation and the calendar on the legislative agenda. In order to keep the large House organized, there is a chain of command between the two parties inside of the House. The majority party is of course led by the Speaker, who underneath of him has the majority leader and majority whip, while the minority party is also electing a minority leader and a minority whip. The party whips have the responsibility of going around and securing the vote for their party, making sure that each member is on board with what that party wants to pass. The most prestigious committee in the House of Representatives is the House Rules Committee. The Rules Committee is responsible for establishing all the policies regarding how bills will be introduced, how they will be reassigned, and the time constraints that are put on members of the House when it comes time to debate a bill. The House Majority Leader, as well as the Speaker of the House, has a lot of control and influence on the House Rules Committee. Its large size of 435 members makes the House a little bit more difficult to control, and by having the Rules Committee, it makes sure that things are going to be on a more formal and timed schedule. There were some legislative powers that were set aside exclusively for the House of Representatives to deal with. One of those in the Constitution states that any revenue bill will always originate in the House of Representatives. This means that anything that deals with tax policies, borrowing, or bonds begins in the House for studying. To make this happen, the House created the Ways and Means Committee, which addresses all tax policies and tax reform bills. This, aside from the Rules Committee, is the second most prominent committee in the House. Other responsibilities that the House have include drafting articles of impeachment against executives, and selecting the President of the United States if no candidate is able to receive a majority in the Electoral College. Because the number of members that a state sends to the House of Representatives is based on its population, it is important to understand how population is tracked in the United States. Every 10 years, the federal government conducts a census to help give it a more accurate profile of its population and where people are moving. A detailed questionnaire is sent out to every American household asking them how many people live in the house, and then for a more detailed breakdown by age, race, and income. The government uses this data to help it make some very critical decisions along the way, one of which is how to prepare a more practical budget that meets the needs of the people, and how to steer their policies towards meeting the demands of that budget. It also helps them make decisions like where they need to upgrade infrastructure in terms of hospitals, schools, and roads throughout the country, and if they need to change the composition of the House of Representatives. Take a look at the map on your screen. The states that are shaded in the darkest colors showed the most rapid population growth from the 2000 census to the 2010 census. Because of this information, some of these states may need to either add or lose representation based on the trends. After the 2010 census was conducted, it was determined that the states in blue had had such rapid population growth that they required more members in the House. To get these members, they borrowed from states in which the growth rate was not on the same level. We call this reapportionment. Reapportionment is the reallocating or redistributing of the number of members in the House that each state receives based on its changes in the population. It is important to remember that this only affects the House of Representatives, as the Senate is given 2 members for every state regardless of population. Also remember that when you change the number of Congress members that a state receives, it will in turn change the number of electoral votes that state gets in the next presidential election. Let's look at Texas, a state that gained representation based on census results. In order to give Texas 2 members in the House of Representatives, you're going to need to physically redraw 2 of the districts to make an additional district for each member who's being added. We call this redistricting. Redistricting is the physical changing of the district lines to accommodate the changes that are needed to either add or lose members to the House of Representatives. It is the job of the individual state legislatures to go back and redraw these lines. Giving the state legislatures the power to redraw the district lines has come at a high price. Dating as far back as the 1800s, Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry told his Federalist Party to redraw his district lines in such a way that the Federalists would be ensured victory in the next congressional elections. The newspapers mocked his district lines, saying that it looked like a salamander, and thus the word gerrymander was created. Gerrymandering is the act of state legislatures drawing their congressional district lines in a way that they know will give their dominant political party an advantage in future elections. This is happening throughout the country as they use census data to determine where conservatives and liberals live in the state, and then draw lines that reflect those political differences. The issue of gerrymandering has shown up on the Supreme Court's door many times over the decades. The 1960s was a very popular decade for these types of cases, including a case known as Baker v. Carr. In Baker v. Carr, the Supreme Court decided that it's within the federal government's right and jurisdiction to investigate and intervene in any cases where they believe the states are abusing their power of redistricting, also known as malapportionment. Southern states used this power a lot in the 1960s to deny African Americans an equal influence in the election process. In the case of Reynolds v. Sims in 1964, the court established its one-person, one-vote precedent. This means that each district must now be drawn in a way in which each of the populations are relatively equal. The upper house of the U.S. Congress is known as the United States Senate. Its requirements to run for office include being at least 30 years old, a 9-year U.S. citizen, and a resident of the state that you wish to represent. Senators have a much longer 6-year term, but also have no term limit and can run for as many consecutive terms as they wish. Senators represent the entire state that they are elected from, and every state is given 2, regardless of its population. Much like the House of Representatives, each senator is selected by a plurality. If they are the candidate with the most votes of all those who run, they become that state's senator. This was changed in the 17th Amendment, as senators used to be selected through a more elitist process. It is also important to remember that only 1/3 of the 100 senators are up for re-election at a given time, that's on 2-year cycles, to try to maintain continuity in the Senate. Divided government has become an almost regular occurrence in American politics. Divided government is a circumstance in which the political party of the president and vice president does not match the dominant party of either one or both houses of Congress. Take the current situation, for example. President Barack Obama and Vice President Joe Biden are members of the Democratic Party, but they are forced to balance out their policy demands with a Congress that is controlled by Republicans in both houses. The most common effect of this is what we call policy gridlock, as it becomes difficult to get policies passed through both branches since they have philosophical and ideological differences. When asked about it, most Americans do say that they would prefer having one party control both branches. However, their electoral behaviors have tended to lead to divided government throughout much of our history, as dissatisfaction with the job of the president has led many people to vote for the other party, traditionally in most midterm elections. The Senate is comprised of 100 total members, as each of the 50 states is given 2 elected senators to represent them. The day-to-day leader in the Senate is the majority leader, who's responsible for presiding over each session, consulting regularly with the president, and handling committee assignments within the Senate. The current majority leader in the U.S. Senate is Kentucky Republican Mitch McConnell. It is important to note, however, that the Constitution actually calls for the vice president to be the leader of the Senate, but because the vice president's role has expanded over time, he's rarely there anymore, and is mainly used only to break 50-50 voting ties. There is also another significant term given to someone in the Senate who has the longest term, and is from the majority party. That person is called the President Pro Tempore. Orrin Hatch of Utah is the current longest tenured member of the Republican Party in the Senate, and thus serves as the President Pro Tempore. According to the 25th Amendment, the President Pro Tempore is third in line in succession for the presidency, behind the Speaker of the House of Representatives. When comparing the day-to-day workings of the Senate, you will find that it's a much more informal atmosphere than the House of Representatives. With less members, the rules tend to not be nearly as strict. This means that debates on legislation are not timed as they are in the House. This allows senators to use a tool that they have used more and more in recent decades, known as the filibuster. With a filibuster, a senator can ask for the floor and then continue to talk about a bill until he talks the bill to death. Such a filibuster was portrayed in the 1939 popular film Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, as the senator gets to his feet, gets the attention of the floor, and speaks as long as he possibly can to try to get the bill abandoned. The only way to stop a filibuster in the U.S. Senate, besides having the senator voluntarily step aside, is through a cloture vote, in which 3/5 of the Senate votes to bring the filibuster to a close. As they are the upper house and have a longer term, the Constitution gives the Senate more prestigious powers. Some of these powers include the ability to approve a treaty that the President has signed through a 2/3 vote. This is true within our system of checks and balances, as the Senate can still reject a treaty that they feel is not fair to the country. The Senate is also given the power to confirm any presidential appointments that are made to the judiciary or to his cabinet through the advice and consent power. This is done through a simple majority vote. They also have the power to hold and conduct trials for impeached executives and determine whether or not that this executive should be removed from office. There are, of course, many powers that both houses of Congress share together. Some of those include the power of the purse, which gives Congress the final discretionary control of the budget, the regulation of all foreign and interstate trade, of course the ability to draft and pass laws, amongst many other powers including the ability to declare war, set immigration policy, and the ability to override a presidential veto with a 2/3 vote in both houses. There are, however, 2 very controversial powers that are given to the U.S. Congress by the Constitution that have been called into question in several Supreme Court cases. One of those is what we call the Necessary and Proper or Elastic Clause. According to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, it states that Congress has the ability or authority to make all laws necessary and proper to govern the nation. This is pretty open-ended and was called into question particularly in the case of McCulloch v. Maryland, as it is argued that Congress has the ability to stretch their powers beyond just the ones that are stated within Article 1. The other controversial power has been the power to regulate commerce. Remember, the Commerce Clause gives Congress not only the ability to regulate trade with other countries, but also in between states. This was called into question with cases like Gibbons v. Ogden and the Heart of Atlanta Motel v. the United States. The Commerce Clause does have limitations, however. The Supreme Court took on the case of the U.S. v. Lopez in 1992, in which a teenage student brought a handgun to school unloaded, was caught with this gun trying to exchange it for money, and then was tried by the federal government in violation of the Gun-Free School Act of 1990. It was determined by the Supreme Court in a 5-4 vote that limitations must be placed on the Commerce Clause, as trying a student under the Gun-Free School Act was actually overstepping the boundaries of the federal government in not allowing the state to enforce its own education and law policies. With the lawmaking process being so long and complex, committees are an important ingredient in the lawmaking process and have been since the establishment of the Republic. Committees in Congress play several key roles in helping them get laws passed, one of which is that it makes the process for studying legislation far more efficient instead of having the entire chamber study each individual bill. It also allows the members of the committees to become experts in their areas. It also gives them time to study the bills in depth before they go out for a full debate and decide which bills are going to be most important to the American people. There are several types of committees that exist in both houses of Congress. Standing committees are set up to deal with permanent issues like the budget. Subcommittees are fragments of standing committees that deal with even more specific issues that the entire committee doesn't deal with all at once. A select committee is set up for a more temporary problem that the Congress hopes to address in the years to come. Something like cyberbullying would be considered a select committee topic. And then, of course, there are conference committees. Once the House and Senate have passed different versions of a bill, they send members from both houses to get together, have a conference, and reconcile the differences. Some of the most prominent committees in the House include the Rules, Ways and Means, and Oversight Committee, while over in the Senate, the Foreign Relations, Appropriations, and Judiciary Committees are some of the most important. The size of a congressional committee varies depending on the issue it's addressing and the level of interest that there is from the members of Congress in joining that committee. Every committee selects a chairperson who comes from the majority party and will oversee the work of that committee. That person also has a second-in-command below them, known as a ranking member, who comes from the minority party. The majority party allocates the committee members in both houses so that every committee is strongly represented by the majority party. Seniority tends to play a bigger role in the Senate than it does in the House when it comes to assigning committee membership. Seniority can determine several things in the Senate, including how close to the front their desk is placed, their ability to be a committee chair, and of course their title, as the longest-serving senator from a state is referred to as the senior senator, and the other senator gets the title of junior senator. As previously stated, the lawmaking process in the United States is very long and very complex, and is usually characterized by requiring the two parties to compromise if they're going to get legislation through. A bill can be written by anybody, a lobbyist or even an everyday citizen, but it must be introduced formally by an elected member of the House or Senate. It is also important to remember that a bill could start in either house and doesn't have to be moving through at the same time in both houses. After the bill is introduced, it is assigned to the appropriate committee who will study the bill, make amendments, and if it's lucky enough, move out for a full debate. It is important to remember that this is where most bills die as they get pigeonholed and left behind, as the committees feel that other bills may just be more important. If the bill is one of the fortunate ones that makes it all the way out to a debate, it will finally be voted on, in which a simple majority is all that's needed to pass the bill. Prior to the passage, the Senate has the ability to conduct filibusters if they want to try to get the bill killed. If by chance the bill has made it through both houses, chances are the two versions are a little bit different. That is when the House and Senate will send members from both houses to go together into a conference committee and try to work out those differences so that they can get one final version voted on and approved. If they're able to do that, the bill is then sent to the President, who by signing it will make it federal law. However, the President also has the ability to veto that legislation, or within the final 10 days of a session he can choose to do nothing using the pocket veto. Though it is very rare, Congress does have the ability, in accordance with checks and balances in the Constitution, to override his veto with a 2/3 vote in both houses. If the law is able to get through either by signage by the President or by override by the Congress, it is in place until a new Congress comes in to amend the law, or if a citizen challenges the law in the federal court system and it is struck down later by the U.S. Supreme Court through the power of judicial review. Once Congress passes a bill and the President signs it into law, it's out of their hands. They have to trust the bureaucracy to enforce the policies that they pass in a way that they believe reflects what they originally intended with the law. This oftentimes gets complicated because the bureaucracy is so large in size and overlaps that policies don't get enforced the way Congress wishes that they would have been. So thus they use their power, what we call legislative or congressional oversight. This is where Congress uses a variety of methods to review, oversee, or monitor the activities of the executive agencies to ensure that their policies are being enforced or implemented appropriately. There are several measures that Congress will take to exercise oversight. One is holding investigative public hearings in which they call people from the executive agency into their chambers and try to get to the bottom of a story or expose corruption. Another thing they may try to do is audit an agency to see where confidential files and money is going to. Because Congress has the power of the purse, they could also alter an agency's budget requests if they feel that that agency is not doing a strong enough job. They also could use the Senate to delay any appointments the President makes to one of his agencies, and they could rewrite the legislation to make it more specific about how they want the policies enforced. In the worst case and most extreme scenario, they may choose to impeach somebody. In order to handle the demands that come with being an elected official to Congress, every member of Congress is provided with funds that help them hire a staff. The average staff size for a member of the House is 17, while the average senator has a staff of about 40 people. These staff members help congressmen and women to carry out many of their day-to-day responsibilities, including managing their calendar, assisting with the writing and studying of legislation, managing their appointments, and consulting and communicating with their constituents back at home. It is important to remember, though, that it's illegal for members of Congress to use their legislative staff to help them with electioneering, their upcoming campaign, or fundraising for that campaign. So what factors influence the way that a member of Congress will vote on legislation? Well, you probably guessed it. Their political party tends to be the best predictor of how they're going to vote on a bill, since their political party oftentimes has a lot of control over their political future. Also, interest groups play a large role, providing lobbyists who will give them critical information, and they hold the key to major campaign donations through PACs. You and I, their constituents, also have a great deal of influence over how they're going to vote, as we have the ability to choose not to re-elect them during the next election cycle. To try to keep us happy and on their side, constituents will use a variety of tools to accomplish this, one of which is casework, in which they provide one-on-one assistance to members of their district. They also will use pork barrel legislation, or earmarks inside of a bill, to help fund small projects that are only going to benefit certain people in their district. Colleagues also have some influence over the way they're going to vote. Through the process of reciprocity, also known as log rolling, sometimes members will cut deals behind closed doors to support each other's bills for a mutual benefit on a bill that they intend to propose later in the future. The President also holds weight with their vote, as the President has the electoral mandate from the people supporting him and has easier access to the media and can send liaisons from the White House to try to confer with members of Congress. Finally, the way that a member of Congress chooses to represent their constituents has a lot to do with their own personal views on why they were sent to Congress in the first place. This will ultimately determine the way that they're going to vote on most pieces of legislation. Some members of Congress believe in the trustee model. That is, that they believe that the people who elected them to Congress are trusting them to use their own personal judgment when it comes to voting on bills, even if that judgment call may differ from what many people in the district want. Others believe that when they were elected to Congress, they were chosen as delegates, and that they are effectively employees of the people who sent them there, meaning that they must vote the way that the people of their district wish for them to vote, regardless of what their personal feelings might be or what extra information they may have been given. I hope that this review of Unit 5 of AP U.S. Government and Politics, entitled The U.S. Congress, has been beneficial for you. Good luck on the AP exam in May.